The year is 1967. Deep in the jungles of North Vietnam, a man wakes up in total darkness. His hands are bound, his body is broken, and he has no idea how long he's been here. Somewhere in the distance, a scream cuts through the silence. Not a cry for help, but a sound of pure, relentless agony. It wasn't a nightmare. This was reality for American prisoners of war in Vietnam. Captured soldiers weren't just held prisoner. They were beaten, starved, and tortured with methods designed to break them physically and psychologically. They were stripped of their dignity, forced into stress positions for days, and subjected to brutality so extreme that many never made it out alive. Just how far were the Viet Cong willing to go to break these men? And how did anyone survive the nightmare? To understand the full horror, we have to go back to the moment it all began. The Vietnam War didn't start with a full-scale invasion. It began in the shadows with advisors, covert missions, and political maneuvering. By the early 1960s, North Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh, was waging a brutal communist insurgency against the US-backed South Vietnamese government. America, determined to stop the spread of communism, sent in military advisors, then troops, then bombers. What was supposed to be a limited engagement quickly spiraled into a full-blown war. By 1965, US combat troops were on the ground, battling a relentless enemy in unfamiliar terrain. Dense jungles, hidden tunnels, and an opponent that knew every inch of the land. The North Vietnamese, outmatched in firepower, relied on guerrilla warfare, setting booby traps, launching surprise ambushes, and dragging American troops into a brutal, unforgiving conflict. For US pilots, the skies weren't safe either. Anti-aircraft guns and Soviet-made missiles turned the air into a deadly battlefield. Many pilots were shot down, captured, and taken to places they had only heard whispers about. For those who fell into enemy hands, there was no Geneva Convention, no mercy, no guarantees of survival, and that's where their nightmare truly began. Most POWs weren't taken on the battlefield. They were ambushed, trapped, shot down. For American pilots, the danger wasn't just in the sky, it was what waited if they were forced to eject over enemy territory. Many were captured the moment they hit the ground, surrounded by North Vietnamese soldiers and furious villagers eager for revenge. One of the most infamous cases was John McCain, a man who would later become a US senator, a presidential candidate, and a defining voice on military and foreign policy. In 1967, his plane was shot down over Hanoi, forcing him to eject. He landed in Truc Bac Lake, both arms and a leg shattered on impact. He was dragged to shore not by soldiers, but by an angry mob. They beat him senseless, shattering what bones weren't already broken, and stabbed him with bayonets before handing him over to the North Vietnamese army. McCain would spend more than 5 years as a POW, enduring brutal torture, solitary confinement, and constant psychological warfare. Despite being offered early release due to his father's status as a US Navy admiral, he bravely refused to leave ahead of his fellow prisoners, adhering to the military code of conduct. I knew that every prisoner the Vietnamese tried to break, those who had arrived before me and those who would come after me, would be taunted with the story of how an admiral's son had gone home early, a lucky beneficiary of America's class-conscious society, McCain later recalled. For soldiers on the ground, capture was often just as brutal. Booby traps, jungle ambushes, and betrayals by informants left many stranded behind enemy lines, where they were quickly surrounded and taken alive to be tortured. Captured soldiers were stripped of their weapons, their gear, everything except their dog tags. Then came the forced marches. Hundreds of miles through the jungle, barefoot, beaten, starving, and sick. Anyone who collapsed from exhaustion was left to die or executed on the spot. Their next stop, a place designed to break them in every possible way. The most infamous of these camps was Hoa Lo Prison, better known as the Hanoi Hilton, a name given sarcastically by the men who suffered inside. But there was nothing hospitable about it. The cells were barely big enough to lie down in. The walls were covered in filth, insects, and the stench of human suffering. Rats scurried through the corridors, feeding on whatever scraps of food or flesh they could find. Prisoners were often kept in isolation, locked in tiny windowless cells for months at a time, cut off from the outside world, from their fellow soldiers, from any sense of time. Malnutrition, disease, and brutality were constant, and the suffering didn't stop with just physical pain. Their captors wanted more than just their bodies. They wanted their minds, their loyalty, their complete and utter submission. And they would use any means necessary to get it. One of the most infamous torture methods was known as the rope trick. Prisoners were forced to sit on the floor, arms tied behind their backs, with ropes pulling their shoulders together until their bones felt like they would snap. Then, they were hoisted into the air, their own body weight tearing at their joints. Many passed out from the pain, only to be revived and subjected to the torture all over again. Some POWs suffered permanent nerve damage, their arms left useless for the rest of their lives. For those who resisted too much, there was the meat hook. Prisoners were suspended by their wrists, often for days, until their shoulders dislocated, their muscles tore, and their circulation cut off completely. The pain was unbearable, and if they passed out, they were woken up, only for the torture to continue. Some men weren't tortured in a single violent session. Some were left to rot. In jungle camps, POWs were thrown into tiny bamboo cages, barely big enough to crouch in. There, they were left for weeks, even months, exposed to torrential rains, blistering heat, and swarms of insects that feasted on their open wounds. Daily beatings were routine, sometimes with fists, other times with rubber hoses, bamboo sticks, or the butt of a rifle. Many never made it out alive. While American soldiers fought and died in the jungles of Vietnam, a very different kind of battle was unfolding back home. By the late 1960s, the United States was deeply divided. The Vietnam War had dragged on for years, with no clear victory in sight. Young men were being drafted by the thousands, shipped off to a country they barely understood, and coming home in body bags. At first, many Americans believed in the war, trusting the government's promise that stopping communism in Vietnam was necessary to protect the world from Soviet expansion. But as the war escalated, public trust crumbled. In 1968, the Tet Offensive took place. It was a massive surprise attack by North Vietnamese forces, proving that despite years of fighting, the US wasn't winning. That same year, Americans heard reports of the My Lai massacre, where it was said that American soldiers had killed hundreds of innocent Vietnamese civilians, fueling anti-war sentiment. Young men, many still teenagers, were being sent to die in a war that no longer made sense to the public. Protests erupted on college campuses nationwide. By 1970, protests against the war were everywhere. College students burned draft cards, thousands marched in Washington, and some soldiers even refused to fight. In 1970, the Kent State Massacre was a breaking point. National Guard troops opened fire on student protesters, killing 4 and injuring 9. For many Americans, Vietnam was no longer just a foreign war. It was a symbol of government lies, pointless bloodshed, and a fight that had already been lost. For the men actually fighting in Vietnam, it was a devastating betrayal. They risked their lives in the jungle, while back home people spat on them, called them murderers, and told them they were fighting for nothing. And for the soldiers who were captured, it was even worse. They weren't just prisoners of war. They became forgotten men, locked away in brutal conditions while the world moved on without them. Back in Vietnam, POWs were forced to sign false confessions, admitting to war crimes they never committed. Some were even paraded on camera, forced to read propaganda statements under threat of torture or execution. Soldiers like John McCain, Jeremiah Denton, and James Stockdale refused to cooperate, despite enduring horrific beatings, waterboarding, isolation, and starvation. Locked away in separate cells, POWs also developed a secret communication system, the tap code. By tapping on the walls, they spelled out letters of the alphabet, passing messages between cells. It was a lifeline, a way to maintain morale and unity, a reminder that they were not alone. Some men even whispered messages through air vents or scratched words onto hidden scraps of paper, keeping the spirit of resistance alive. Much of the world had no idea what was happening inside these camps. The North Vietnamese denied torturing prisoners and used POWs for propaganda, forcing them to appear in staged interviews to claim they were treated well. But then came a moment of pure defiance. In 1966, Jeremiah Denton, an American pilot held captive in Hoa Lo prison, was forced to appear on camera for a propaganda broadcast. As he sat under the harsh lights, answering questions in a monotone voice, he did something no one expected. He blinked, not randomly, but in Morse code, TORTURE, a silent, desperate message to the US military, confirming what they had feared. POWs were being brutalized. This single act exposed North Vietnam's lies to the world, proving that the so-called humane treatment of POWs was a farce. On July 6, 1966, the North Vietnamese orchestrated what they believed would be a public spectacle of humiliation. Nearly 50 American POWs were forced to march through the streets of Hanoi, surrounded by thousands of furious North Vietnamese citizens who had been encouraged to spit on them, curse them, and throw rocks and garbage at them. The Vietnamese intended this as a propaganda victory, expecting the prisoners to hang their heads in shame, broken and defeated. Instead, they walked tall, showing no fear and refusing to let their captors break them. They stood defiant, refusing to give the regime the victory they so desperately wanted. Furious, the guards responded with merciless beatings, savagely punishing the prisoners for their display of strength. But the message had been sent. They would never be truly conquered. Even when their bodies were broken, their minds remained strong. And finally, after years of captivity, the war began to turn and freedom was within reach. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, officially ending US involvement in Vietnam. As part of the agreement, North Vietnam was forced to release all American POWs. What followed was Operation Homecoming, a coordinated effort to bring the prisoners back to the United States. One by one, thin, battered men stepped onto waiting military planes, many of them for the first time in years. They were given real food, fresh uniforms, and medical care, but for most, the reality of their freedom didn't feel real yet. When the first POWs landed back on US soil, the moment was overwhelming. Soldiers who had been presumed dead were suddenly embracing their families again. Some had missed the birth of their own children. Others had spent years believing they would die in a cage. But freedom didn't erase the scars. For many, the war never truly ended. Years of torture and malnutrition left them with lifelong physical injuries, nerve damage, shattered joints, and chronic pain. Others suffered from severe PTSD, haunted by the screams of fellow prisoners and the memories of the friends they left behind in unmarked graves. Some, like John McCain, returned to service, refusing to let their past define them. Others struggled to reintegrate into normal life, their minds still trapped inside the prison cells they had fought so hard to escape. And not all of them came home. Many POWs were never accounted for, their fate unknown. Families waited decades for answers, but some would never get them. Hoa Lo Prison, once a place of unimaginable suffering, still stands today, but now it has been turned into a museum, one that tells a very different story. The North Vietnamese government portrays it as a place where American POWs were treated well, showing staged photos of prisoners playing basketball, smiling, and receiving medical care. The reality, the starvation, the beatings, the torture, has been erased from their version of history. But the men who lived through it haven't forgotten. Decades later, what has the world learned? North Vietnam was never held accountable for the war crimes committed against these men. Should the US have done more to bring them home? Should these soldiers have been there in the first place? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for more harrowing stories throughout history.